Welcome to this extension video of Level Up Episode 3. In the episode, I mentioned that I have more footage of the gouache painting that I'd like to share, but it would have strangled the episode being too long. So instead, I've made this separate video, still sped up of course, but to show more of the painting process at length. The original painting took about an hour and 45 minutes in total. Hopefully the commentary gives you enough insight into what I was thinking about while building it out. This process gives me a total understanding of who my character is, and I try to do this with every character in the story if I can. I'm never burning any time guessing at each new image I have to paint with the character in it. It's almost like I can go on autopilot now during production because of what I know from what I've learned capturing his personality and color character through the painting process. The only thing left standing between me and a good quality drawing of him is my ability to act within my drawing or through my drawing. These are plan view drawings, front and side, like police mugshots. These drawings are one more step in learning about the character. In this case, the base color values that make up what he looks like. He being Fletch, the character I've been developing on my show Level Up, where I teach a broad range of tools and skills for all artists. These drawings are loose, not labored over. The hard work will go into the painting. The drawings are much easier to do with all the prior design work that I've put into them up to this point. This loose sketching layout approach is also helpful for me in that it gives me a chance to find an abstraction that represents the facts. I'm loosely holding the pencil to avoid the death grip and all those uptight lines that go with it. Again, the paint is where all the life is. The drawing is the boundaries for where all the playing should stay. It really shouldn't matter how good your figure drawing skills are to do this kind of work. All skills will improve with practice. And when the drawing is finished, it's time to set up the palette. Here are the colors that I'm using for the painting. Note how there are warm and cool versions of each hue. I'll talk more about this in depth as I continue painting. Note to future self, coated paper plates are not good palettes for gouache as they soak up the wetness of the paint really fast, and I felt more like I was racing for time to use up the paint than feeling relaxed painting the image. This first stage of the painting is the transparent stage. This is also called the wash stage, where the paint is thinned down with an excessive amount of water to keep it thin and extra transparent. I would say at this stage the paint is thinned with at least 5 parts water to 1 part pigment, and a little less for some areas, but maximizing the amount of water for flow and transparency, but where you can still see enough of the pigment. This stage is a tonal primer, or the stage you establish the darker local values and the shadow values. Keeping the paint transparent helps keep the shadows from being equally impacting to our eyes and prevents the shadows from competing with the lights, as well as helps let them sink back into the background so they don't lift or rise forward like the lights should. I'm using burnt umber and ultramarine blue. This stage of the painting, I'm trying to keep everything very dark and very earthen, so there's no other hues needed at this point. The ultramarine blue I'm using is also a warm blue, but cool in correlation to the brown, which is my warm at this time. I'll use the blue for halftone areas where there might be close cut or close shaved hair on him, and for his work suit. Since this is serving as a character analysis, I don't really want the painting to have complex shadows. Especially since this character is a good character, he's not going to have deep impacting shadows on him. Most of the time, that is. I keep things simple and top light him with shallow shadows, which allows his local colors to really remain vivid and easy to recognize. Once enough of the underpainting has been established, it's then time to move on to the opaque paint and the light side of the form. I begin the opaque painting with all the blue stuff. I just freshly mixed it for the wash layer and decided to expand upon it. All the hues have white added to them when they're lightened. This is what changes the color's appearance, like this blue, from how it looked when it was a wash. It now lifts or rises to the surface. Why, you ask? The paint with no white and all water content is 1, a wash, so it's transparent, and 2, whatever mineral or material that it's made from doesn't have the same reflective properties as the white pigment does. So basically, the color lacks reflectivity. Adding the white to any of these hues will lighten the overall value, but it will also give the paint more opacity, thereby reflecting the light versus absorbing the light rays. Some of these new pigments, this blue being one of them, will look greatly out of place until other neighboring hues are added to balance out the overall light on the physical forms. I'm painting this image with 2 brushes, both being rounds. The brand here is called Artist Loft, a cheapish brush that can be purchased off the shelf at an art store called Michael's or on Amazon. The other brush is also a less expensive brush called Systems by Daler-Rowney. It's the one I'll be using with the yellow handle. The Daler-Rowney was $2 at a store in Westminster called Art Supply Warehouse. Neither brush is superb, but neither brush is all that bad either. They both hold their point, hold a decent amount of water once the soap layer that keeps the brush tip shape at purchase is washed off. They're strong enough to blend dry pigment, but a few of the substitute brands that I ended up using because I ran out of my usual pigments did not like to reactivate very well. This means they didn't like to re-wet so I could blend them after I painted them down, which is kind of a bummer because that's what gouache is known for doing. Much of the paint, anything with white added to it, sort of stubbornly resisted blending. The hues without the white pigment added blended as they should. This forced me to proceed with this picture a little bit differently. Rather than fighting it, I just changed my approach and mixed more values in my value and temperature strings than I usually do when I premix. And I ended up painting more frequent strokes of temperature and value changes, which will also give the same optical appearance of gradating together seamlessly from a distance. I'm also taking full advantage of the tone paper to be used as part of the value transitions of his forms. I use a little more water in the pigment and it shifts the values, darkening them based upon the water to pigment ratio that's been made. I also painted this image with a round, or a bunch of round brushes since I'm making it up as I go. I'm adding much smaller dabs of paint to the surface to really scrutinize if the value is working correctly or if it's jumping too much. As usual, I premix many hues of the same value for different areas of the head, much like the ubiquitous yellow, red, cool, blue or green, facial color step down from brow to chin, as you can see here in the diagram. I paint from larger areas to smaller areas, and because of the blending out problem with the lights, I'm forced to add the darks on last, but I know they'll blend out, which will help me with softening the color breaks. So again, just shifting the approach gives me back the effect that I need. It's just done in a different order. With the round brush, I'm just drawing like I would with a pencil, the only obvious difference being the wetness versus the dryness of the media. I'm hatching the paint onto the surface, partly because of the invention, but also partly because of the material changes. If I can't reactivate the paint to soften the edges out, then I'm relying upon a hatching approach to help me with the same illusion, just done differently. Gouache dries lighter than when first painted down, which also gives the paint a much richer, chromatic look when first applied. Much of what I paint here looks crazy out of sync until it dries in. Sometimes it looks too colorful, sometimes it just looks totally out of value, which then reveals the big moment of truth being, of course, when everything dries. You finally get a chance to see, does it actually work, or do I need to do something more with it? Either paint it into what's already there to lighten it up, paint over it to hide it, or paint over it with a slightly lighter value version of the same color to make an adjustment to it. Technically speaking, you have to think about these things because each will either work successfully or do great damage to what you've already built, which means you'll then have to let everything dry, go back in, and kind of repaint the area. Because it dries lighter, some of the value choices have to be even darker than they'd normally be if you're using other mediums, which again will feel totally out of context until they dry. I think this is in itself what makes gouache seem so difficult to so many artists and people learning art. There's a huge learning curve with just this alone, just this how does it look wet versus how it looks dry thing that we need to remember as part of our training. It really does feel like a dark time or a period when we often blame ourselves for everything that we're doing wrong. rather than recognizing that this process takes time and we have to go through many failures to make the adjustments so that we can feel more confident with making the right choices. I keep the shadows light enough so the forms don't fracture into contrasting puzzle pieces. Adjusting the temperature of the color more than the value contrast keeps the skin light in appearance throughout the head and the neck. As the painting gets closer to the finish, what initially appeared absurdly out of context, either in value or in hue, now fits nicely within the matrix of colors it's woven into. These more opaque strokes have much less water in them than the wash stage. If I was to put a number on it, I'd say 2 to 3 parts water versus 1 part pigment. Gouache really always needs water added to it, or the gum arabic in the pigment stubbornly resists moving or spreading across the surface very much at all. It's amazing how much it just doesn't move. So water's always needed, but sometimes you just need a little tiny bit of it just to make it move. In the case of what I was doing here, I needed water constantly to keep things flowing. I bounce back and forth between both angles, but I favor the forward gaze overall to help me see Fletch fully. Then I work out how to transfer all the brushstrokes or the colors over to their corresponding location in the other view. At a certain point, both views help inform each other. Until that point, it's too early to deep dive and scrutinize the progress. It's just basically build until you get to a point of completion, then scrutinize. I run into this problem a lot where I see a student who questions every single brush stroke as they put them down, and you really have to have enough of the picture put down in order to even start looking at those brush strokes to make any sense of them. You'll see me continuously add more paint to each area. Sometimes there's a lot of pigment, sometimes it's just water. I'm re-wetting the spot to keep building up on it, trying to build up a little more lightness on top just a little bit at a time without overdoing it all at once. I'm not looking for pure white, I'm looking for the light, and that has to be well controlled, especially once you start building up the brightness of it. When I place down the darks on top of everything else, in the wrong order of course because of what's happening here, they have a very outlined look and feel to them. So to soften them, I'll first stack pigment on top of the outlines, trying to expand the spots until they fit whatever surface area I'm currently building up. I'm just basically thinking of edges, but these are planal edges, very, very small edges. The expansion of the stroke is rescaling the surface, the plane the color represents in its minute scale. In fact, every color spot represents a small area of a larger surface, a small plane. The smaller the plane change, the more fidelity or resolution that's added to the form. Outlines can be surfaces so long as the outline varies, expanding and contracting with the anatomy. That again is the planal edge of the form. Gouache is usually very forgiving. Brand dependent, any gouache piece can be reactivated at any time, minutes later or years later. Many believe it can't be softened or blended, which is not true. It just takes a lot of stubborn work to find the sweet spot where the water doesn't do much damage or lifts all the pigment up, which requires that you learn to control your brush, the pressure of the brush, and the water in the brush. That takes some time to get all of those things to synchronize. Although I showed you a good number of colors on the palette, it's still limited in hues. Between all of them, it's still just red, yellow, and blue on the palette. The increased number of hues on the palette is for temperature shifting within each hue. Therefore, all the secondary colors have to be mixed into existence: orange, green, and purple. It was easy to find oranges. They automatically occur with the red and the yellow, mixing those two together to make many different types of flesh tones. Purples are also pretty easy with the red and the blue. As soon as you mix them together, no matter what, you're getting a purple. But green isn't necessarily one you're going to mix into right away. Green isn't a color that most people think about when they paint faces. Optically, it's going to appear somewhere, either in a mixture of light and local color, or in just a local color. The old masters used to claim that in order to bring a painting up to a level convincing enough to fool a viewer of its realism, it needs all the primary hues of the color spectrum. Back then, they were red, yellow, blue, purple, and green. White and black was also a part of this formula. For a long time, my painting lacks a greenness to it. A painting will visually tell you what it lacks in color. And in my case, there's an overabundance of red and bluishness all over it. Yellow is kind of present, but recedes behind the red and the blue that can be visually seen all over within all the mixtures throughout the painting. And this definitely becomes a problem. It's not until later that I mix green in, kicking myself for not having mixed it sooner. But that's the way it goes sometimes. And like I said, the painting will begin telling you what color it's missing if you pay attention to it. The green acts as a transitional hue, softening the extreme differences that yellow and purple can have between them, since they are so distant from one another on the color wheel. And this is sort of what started happening with this picture until I brought the greens into the shadow spaces. You'll see me push the brush into the surface in addition to pulling it across the surface. Pushing it against the grain breaks up the hairs and the organized point or the shape that the brush is built for. This helps greatly with giving the brush strokes more life in them, as well as adding a little bit of that, I guess you could call it painterliness into the work that so many of us end up shying away from when we really want to put it in, but don't really know how or where to do that. Since this painting is purely exploration, I have no problem working this way, knowing that when I allow for this kind of behavior in the brushwork, I can sometimes find something I never knew I'd be able to do.